Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you happen to be. Thank you for joining us today for our really quite unique webinar. We're happy to have you here. Entitled the Cloud Luminary Lounge, this is a Q&A webinar intended to help you learn about the ins and outs of what's happening in the cloud market and how you can best leverage this resource for your enterprise IT infrastructure. We are very fortunate today that we have two incredibly intelligent gentlemen to join us to talk about cloud. They're visionaries in their spaces, and they've done a lot of work with enterprise IT data centers, with storage, with cloud, with virtualization, with pretty much everything that makes up what we use today and where we're going in the future. To start with, we have Steve Harrod, who's the Managing Director of General Catalyst Partners. Steve, thank you for being here today.
Great to be here. It's fun to be back with Kieran as well. We've worked together over the years.
And we then have Kieran Hardy, who's co-founder and CTO of Tintree. Kieran, thank you for being here today as well.
Thank you very much, Scott, and good to be here with you, Steve, as well.
My name is Scott Lowe. I'm a partner with Actual Tech Media, and I'll be moderating today's event. We started out, I'm going to go to the next slide because we want to talk about some of the rules of engagement for today's event. First of all, don't hold back. If you have a question, please make use of the Q&A box in the GoToWebinar control panel that you have on your screen. We will be answering your questions live on today's event. For all of you that registered for today's webinar, you also have the opportunity to ask us questions in advance. On the registration form, we had a place where you could ask your most burning cloud questions. We've taken those questions and we're going to be answering a number of them live today. So hopefully that will provide you with some insight that you were hoping to glean when you signed up for this event. We're going to try to ask as many questions as we can while we have these two fine gentlemen in the same room. So please ask away. This is an opportunity to help you solidify your cloud strategy and make sure that you're going down a good path for your organization. At the end of today's event, we'll be giving away a $300 Amazon gift card as well, just in time for Black Friday. So you'll want to hang around for that as well. We're going to focus around two general themes for today's event. The first one is going to be sort of the fundamentals of cloud, the strategic discussion that people are having in boardrooms and in IT organizations around the world around what is this and why do we want it? And then we have to move on from the strategic to the tactical. We want to help you understand how best to move forward as you look at what can be a relatively confusing marketplace. There's all kinds of terms around there. Different vendors in the space use different terms differently, adding to the confusion. So we want to make sure that you have a full understanding of exactly what everything means, so when you go down the journey on your own, that you don't run into any roadblocks. So we'll start with the fundamentals, strategic discussion around cloud computing. And let's start by asking Steve this question. Steve, when we think about cloud, what is it that's driving companies to have so much interest in cloud little c in general, not necessarily public, private, or hybrid at this point, but just in cloud technologies?
Yeah, you'll hear this from a lot of different people over the years, and it's been going on for more than a decade now. Number one, people are really, at the end of the day, looking for how can they move faster as a business, and I think cloud encapsulates a lot of this. How do I move faster? You'll hear it called agility or speed, and it applies across all the different aspects of the business. So if I'm a developer, I want to spin up my machines as quickly as possible. I don't want to file trouble tickets and wait for someone in IT to do things. This notion of swipe a credit card and get the resources I need ASAP is something that's there. If I'm in marketing, it might be how do I quickly scale up a marketing campaign as quickly as ever, either through some type of application that's running somewhere else or a way that I've created an application to be able to use these cloud resources. And the examples go on, but at the very core of it, most people, when they say cloud, are how can I do something faster or more agile and not be held up from a lot of the traditional things I might associate with IT.
One of the ways that I've described this is I see cloud as a journey, not a destination. And I think that's sort of what you're alluding to there, Steve. It's about the outcomes, not necessarily where you're going to end up. Kieran, what about you? What are you seeing companies be so interested in today with regard to cloud?
Yeah, it's definitely, as Steve said, about the agility as a big driver. And I think also there's another reason that we certainly see in terms of use of public cloud. It's really around the renting versus owning. and specifically in cases where they have a peak performance at some time, or they may not be able to predict performance, and there can be a lot of benefits from actually running in a public cloud for those kind of applications. I think the really interesting one is on the cost side, where I think in many cases there's been a belief that going to cloud is going to reduce your costs. We just had a conversation with an analyst yesterday, and he was saying that a lot of people have been disappointed with cost reductions from actually going to cloud. But I think the agility advantage, the ability to be able to do things yourself, obviously it's very compelling to developers. And then I think what's happening now is that this whole agility story of moving faster has actually gotten up even beyond the CIO and has gotten up to the CEO level. And what we're seeing increasingly is that enterprise companies are being driven by their CEO that's saying, we want to move faster, and they're going to the IT department and saying, what's your cloud story? And in many cases, they actually may not have the expertise to be able to do that. So I think it's evolved a bit over time, and I think we can expect that it's going to change a bit as people learn what works and what doesn't.
As a follow-on to that question, when you think about the outcomes that companies can experience when they start to move towards cloud-like technologies or cloud technologies directly, what is the business experiencing with the implementation of these kinds of technologies? I mean, is it really mostly agility? Is there a top-line revenue driving capability here that we didn't have before? Steve?
I'll take a quick run at the. Yeah,
go ahead, Steve. Yeah,
I think it's a lot of those things, Scott, and I believe I hear a lot of people who have gotten going with it. And you have a lot of original expectations, and then you have a lot of things that play out over time. And Kieran can add to this, but I think what a lot of times we see is that people get started in what a lot of people refer to as shadow IT, meaning they've sort of circumvented IT, and they've gone and like literally swiped a credit card and expensed something, and they get going and see that it's faster. And then you'll find out that over time, not surprisingly, there are a lot of benefits to having more control around this and being able to, whether it's around getting better cost management or buying the tools that can help everyone who's using these technologies be more productive. So you tend to see sort of this adoption at the edges, and then I think in the more forward-looking enterprises, whether it's an internal cloud or an external cloud, they're finding ways to centralize and hopefully make things better as it scales for more and more users. Go ahead, Kieran.
Yeah, so just in terms of specific example, and this would be one of our customers who's deployed a cloud, and this is a technology company that's actually doing this for development. And they deployed something that's across 3 different continents, 8 different data centers, and they're creating 50,000 VMs a month within their environment. So they actually got a number of benefits from it. One was, the products come out faster, which is obviously a good thing. And they had reduced costs. So they did both in terms of how much it cost to actually buy the infrastructure. They had self-service. And they also didn't have to have a lot of people managing the environment. So I think if you do this stuff correctly, you can get a lot of benefits. These things can actually be really transformational.
Absolutely. And let's see what, when we look at the audience, we've had some other questions around cloud, but let's move on to the next question, and then we can get some deeper into some of the other responses we've gotten from our audience first, because I think this question is really important, because we hear about big C cloud, the public cloud all the time in these kinds of conversations, but we also hear about things like private cloud, hybrid cloud, enterprise cloud. Kieran, when you think about the different kinds of cloud options that are out there, what are they sort of in a nutshell, and what are the very high level benefits you get from each different type?
Yeah, sure. So let me describe the public cloud first, and there actually, I think there's a a usage that people have here, which I think is probably the most common one, which is public cloud really means the AWS's, the Azures, the Google, and AWS obviously being the biggest one here. And it's essentially a infrastructure as a service that's being provided by these companies, essentially a rental model. The big advantage of this is very, very good self-service and a very extensively deployed infrastructure. We at Tintri are actually using AWS for some of the things that we're doing. And so if you're doing your applications in a particular style that require deployment across multiple different data centers for availability, very good fit. But better fit for when you're starting out writing what people have called cloud native applications. The thing that I think matured over the last few years is really the private cloud, and this is the really two primary ways that people use this term. The first is where you have something that's deployed on a customer site that has automation, that has self-service, and that has many of the benefits of the public cloud. But one of the big benefits is you're not rewriting your applications. You can take your existing VMware infrastructure or Hyper-V infrastructure and actually deploy it. And people really do this stuff in two ways. One is, again, on a customer side, but there's a lot of service providers that are doing this as well. And these are people that are taking existing applications. They could be, SQL Server or Oracle or SAP or desktops, and then deploying that in an environment where you have, again, a high degree of automation and self-service. On the hybrid side, and we actually polled our customers last year on this. I think most companies are hybrid in some way. They have some SaaS, so they're using Salesforce, or they're using NetSuite. They're doing some things on premise, and they're in many cases they're actually using service providers. They're using some Amazon or Azure for some of their infrastructure. I think what we are seeing, and this is, I think, fairly new, is we're seeing some degree of integration of the private and the public environment. One of the things that we're seeing as the initial use case is really around storing data for data protection, long-term archive in the public cloud, where that's something that's highly available. But I think we're going to see this space evolving pretty rapidly over the next few years. I think VMware running on AWS is going to make things particularly interesting. Steve may have some comments about that. It's something, again, that it's a very, very rapidly moving space. But most companies have a mixture of all of these kind of environments.
What's your take on the different kinds of clouds and how they've sort of evolved over the last few years to create what we see today, which is in some cases, some confusion with people.
Lots of confusion. I think Kieran did a good job of breaking down a lot of it. This is, a lot of marketing efforts, and a lot of traditional vendors sort of rebranding themselves as sort of cloud has made it complex. I'll just sort of restate a few of the things Kieran said and then add one thing. I do think at the core, this notion of cloud has a lot of core concepts. It's fast-moving and agile. It's self-service. Whether cross-charging or buying it, you're kind of paying by usage. So they're core traits that people associate with cloud. And then it's sort of, where is that stuff running? Is it running out in someone else's infrastructure, which is typically public, or is it running on yours, which is typically private? I'll just add one nuance to what Kieran said. You hear a lot of terms around this connectivity of your on-premises and your public cloud world. And one term that the listeners might hear a lot is hybrid, which, what I'd say most people believe this is like really tighter connections between these two. I think there's very interesting storage ones as discussed. There might be a management console that kind of hides whether you're running in a public or private cloud. It might be a private tunnel on networking that really connects them tightly. So some people would use different degrees of connectivity between those. I think the most extreme thing you'll often hear too is multi-cloud, which implies a lot of these different resources. There might be SaaS applications, there might be stuff that you're running in your private on-premises cloud, but you're using all these different things and they're not super connected. So I do believe this degree of how tightly tied these things are is what means takes it from being a very tight hybrid cloud to a loosely connected multi-cloud strategy that companies are using.
As you guys were talking, something sort of struck me that I think is sort of an interesting, maybe a sidebar a little bit, but I think is interesting to think about. And Kieran, you're definitely well positioned to answer this. But my question is, if we think about the resources we have in the data center, we've got compute, networking, and storage. With compute and networking, they're ephemeral, transitory things. You can build them up, you can tear them down, and everything's all good. With storage, though, we have a persistence need. What kind of challenges? Because you obviously want to keep your storage. You're not going to tear it down after every use, because you're going to have to save that data. So, what kind of additional challenges this place or opportunities does it place with people especially when you think about private cloud and the world of hybrid?
Yeah, so I think, as you said, storage is actually one of the hardest problems, and I think one of the big things is that just taking, I think, in many cases, existing storage systems and just trying to run them in the cloud doesn't really work. And I think actually one of the fascinating things is that Amazon, when they were starting out, the first service that they did was S3, right? And they did something that was allowing you to have storage that was distributed across different environments that maintained a high degree of availability and reliability. And I think, if you look at what they've done with EC2, that's basically a wrapper largely around a hypervisor. And I don't think that they would have had the same success if they didn't address the storage problem. We actually see the same kinds of things in the private cloud, where I think there've been a lot of projects that have not been particularly successful, or maybe I'll say failed, because of the issues associated with storage. So the new things that I think you have with storage are just supporting a much larger scale. The other thing is having large numbers of applications. So there's an expectation, for example, on the compute side, that VMware particularly has established that applications don't interfere with one another on the compute side. But on the storage side, that has historically not been the case. So you will get interference between applications. So I think that isolation is really critical. And then the final thing is really around automation, of actually having things that have a very well-defined interface that's defined at the right level of granularity. So we've actually been describing this and sort of by analogy, or maybe it's even more than analogy, with Amazon as a web services approach to storage. And I think that what you see is that we've taken this approach. I think VMware has taken this approach with vSAN, which is essentially a private cloud kind of solution. You also see hyperconverged vendors like Nutanix taking a similar approach of having a well-defined interface to storage. So the fundamental thing is that if you don't solve the storage problem, you're not really going to be able to address the whole issue of deploying a private cloud, or either on-prem or at a service provider.
A reminder to the audience, if you have questions for today's speakers, please use the GoToWebinar Q&A control panel, and we will be asking your questions live. In fact, we're going to ask a question directly from the audience right now. It's one that we got from our registration form for this event. And you guys have kind of talked around about this a little bit, but I want to ask it very directly because I think this is one of the big questions people have, and I get it all the time. And then Steve, this is for you. What are the differences between virtualized infrastructure and private cloud?
Yeah, good question, and one that gets asked quite a bit. So at the very core, Kieran and I obviously both worked at VMware and sort of think a lot about virtualization as an underlying technology. Virtualization, as you know, separates and provides a view of hardware that is separate from how it's actually implemented below the scenes. And so it allows you to do things like server consolidation and put lots of things on one place. Something like that is necessary, but certainly not sufficient to be a cloud. When people are talking about cloud, ultimately the things that they are thinking about is how it appears to a user, which to many of you it means there's some sort of self-service ability to log into it and to quickly get going, or an ability to quickly scale and add more resources as you need them. Now, it turns out virtualization is a fantastic way to enable the automation that lets you do self-service. It's a fantastic way to be able to quickly spin up more resources and enable it. But virtualization on its own right does not enable cloud. It's, as I said, it's necessary but not sufficient. Kieran, do you want to add anything on top of the automation and the interaction with it?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, I'm in complete agreement with you. You know, it's a necessary component, but I think in many cases there are really two elements that people are missing. One is if they're you know, if they're not able to automate multiple components of the infrastructure, whether it's networking and storage, then they're really hampered in actually doing that. And they're not able to achieve the self-service and the automation. Now, fortunately, I think there's been huge progress in the last few years on the both on the networking side and also on the storage side, as I've mentioned earlier. And so you actually have the possibility where people have implemented many of the cloud features on a virtualization infrastructure, which has the nice aspect that you can take your existing applications and actually apply some of this incredibly cool capabilities of self-service to without rewriting your application, which is obviously one of the challenges in many cases of moving to the public cloud.
All right, gentlemen, let's move on to our next bullet point here. And Kieran, we're going to talk about this one with you, and I'm going to move on to the next slide in just a second, right after I ask the question. We hear all the time, public cloud, public cloud, public cloud, but so you almost think that that's basically just going to happen. This is the future, but is it really? And do you want to talk about this just a little bit?
Sure. So let me, and I'll get to sort of looking at this stuff here. But the first thing is, in terms of noting how much money is actually spent on IT, right? So there's over $3 trillion that's spent on IT every year, and at the moment, the projections are that number for public cloud, total cloud spending, will grow to about 140 billion in 2019, and that includes both SaaS and infrastructure as a service. So we think that, and we're not alone in this. Obviously, public cloud is going to continue to grow, and SaaS is going to grow, infrastructure as a service is going to grow. Many people are going to take advantage of this. But there's some very interesting data that actually have here on this slide, and this is fairly recent data. It's a survey that IDC, the analyst firm, did in January of this year, and talked to a pretty big pool of people, 11,000 people. And what they were looking at was between 2016 and 2018, where's your budget going to go, right? And they broke it down into a number of different areas. So the first panel is traditional IT, and that could be things that are on your own site, or it could be something that you're running at a colo in some form. And this actually includes virtualization, or sort of fairly simple deployments of virtualization. And not surprisingly, this is declining. And so increasingly people are moving to the public cloud, and they're also moving to the private cloud. So if you look at the right panel here, it shows, as you would expect, that there's an increase in public cloud spending. And this is the spending with the titans, people like Amazon and Microsoft and Google. And then, to me, the surprising one was that the private cloud is growing extremely rapidly. So the expectation is that that's going to grow a combination of on-prem plus things that are deployed at service providers by over 51%. And this is surprising at some level, but I think it also kind of reflects pretty strongly what we see, which is that the technology is now there to be able to do this, particularly with the maturing of the services approach on the networking side and on the storage side. And in many cases, because that technology is available, they can actually deploy more cost effectively, either at a service provider or on-prem. So it's going to grow. Traditional IT is going to decline, and both public cloud and private cloud are going to grow very, very significantly over the next few years.
Steve, any thoughts on this?
No, I think that's right. I think whenever you're looking at where people are prioritizing their spending, they're really having to constantly look at each year at what technologies are now available. And I know we'll talk a little bit, but in addition to the cost argument, there are definitely a number of industries, especially regulated ones, that are constantly watching about where their data should be and thinking about the implications of that, which for at least some class of applications drives them more likely to be investing in their own on their own premises offerings versus using some of the public clouds. That's been changing and being looked at quite a bit over the years, but I think that's another factor going into this slide that Kieran talked through.
And as we know, cost is a key factor for whether they say it is or not. It's a key factor for people. So, Steve, this will be for you, but this is not a loaded question at all. Which is cheaper, public or private cloud?
You sure it's not a loaded question? I think it's a tricky one. I think it always depends on a number of different things, as you can imagine. There's never like a straightforward answer. But I think even as we open the conversation, oftentimes if you don't have a lot of predictability and you have huge swings in how much utilization of resources your business needs, then you can find something that works better when you don't have a lot of resources that are not being used in a good way on your own premises offerings. So when there's big up and down in terms of resource usage, oftentimes that will have better cost model in the more flexible public clouds. I think if you are a very tightly run IT organization that has good controls and can provide what's needed and even have good governance around it, then oftentimes you can control some of these surprise bills that you might get from the public clouds. And then lastly, I think in particular, and this isn't the case for a lot of the broader enterprises, but you do hear this a lot from whether it's some startup or someone who is running a pretty homogeneous set of applications. In those cases, you can really tighten the definition of your own infrastructure and your software to be really well honed for what you're doing. And this might be a big data cluster of some kind. It might be batch applications of some kind. Obviously, if you're someone like Facebook, it might be for your relatively small diversity of apps. Those have been proven to be pretty clear cases where you can build your own cloud and have very, very good cost advantages.
Kieran, as you look at especially some of the solutions that Chintry supports in private cloud applications, tell us a little bit about the cost differential between a private cloud solution and public cloud options. And actually, as far as the opportunity cost goes as well.
From what sense, Scott?
I mean, obviously, when you think about going public cloud versus private cloud, it's a combination of workload requirements and cost, but there's also opportunity cost to doing one or the other, right? So if you're going to spend more money to build out a local application or a local infrastructure, there's going to be an upfront capex expense. So in that kind of that kind of spend.
Yeah, so I'm, first of all, I want to agree with Steve just in terms of the areas that are really good fits for the public cloud. The canonical example there is obviously Netflix, which has very, very bursty workloads and, would have cost a fortune for them to be able to implement it, themselves. And they got a lot of benefits from implementing that in a public cloud environment. I actually think that probably one of the biggest areas where people benefit from, or where private cloud is going to be the right solution is if you have an existing infrastructure, there's a whole bunch of existing applications, and if you move them, you're going to have to, let's say you've deployed VMware DRS or you've deployed VMware HA, and you have particular backup software that you're actually deploying in your environment. You have a disaster recovery model. Moving those to the public cloud just doesn't make any sense, right? So because you're actually starting from scratch, and you're also going to have to in regulated industries, you're going to have to go back through some compliance. So I think I think most organizations are going to use both, and we're going to increasingly use both environments. We're deploying things when we're doing analytics and that require certain resources for short periods of time. It actually makes sense to do that in the public cloud environment. But I think you have to be not go with the hype of either going completely one way or going the other way.
Let's talk a little bit about something that's always on people's minds with regard to cloud, and that's security. But security, when we're talking about it in this context, is sort of a dual-pronged issue. One is directly people accessing my data, but increasingly it's also an issue as international boundaries start to get a little bit gray with data. Data sovereignty. How does that affect the choices that people make between public and private clouds? Steve, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, security in this whole arena is a big topic. Let's start just with the data sovereignty piece. And not surprisingly, because of all sorts of leaks and things in politics and everything that we're hearing about, different countries have been concerned with where data might reside. And so you hear about data sovereignty laws referring to kind of physical boundaries restricting where certain types of data should go. And not surprisingly, these are things like personal information or perhaps financial information that is particularly sensitive. So in those cases, the basics around laws that you're hearing about are this piece of data should not go outside of the boundaries of this country. And in a lot of the public cloud situations so far, the whole nature of it is not to explicitly allow you to choose where something is running. You lose some of the flexibility and benefits there. So when you hear about these data sovereignty laws, it typically means certain types of data needs to remain within physical boundaries, even in a world that's increasingly less physically oriented. And so that in turn will drive companies either to keep things, in some cases within their own company walls, and in other companies, in other places, it might be, let's keep it to some type of service provider, but they have to be in a particular country. So you'll hear about data sovereignty. What you need to ask around that is what types of data are restricted, and what are the restrictions? Is it who can have access to it? Is it where it physically resides? There's a much broader discussion around security in clouds, which I think is something that always comes up. And you'll hear every new company when they're moving to a new SaaS vendor or to a new infrastructure as a service vendor, they want to know a lot of questions of that vendor. Who has access to the data? What would happen if someone left? All these sort of things that are part of the, I'd say traditionally they are parts of questionnaires you ask third-party vendors. Increasingly they are something that they ask their auditors and that sort of thing. And in many cases there may be a sometimes true, sometimes false assumption that if it's my IT department and it's sitting within my data center, then it's more secure. I don't think that's always true, but that is certainly an assumption that a lot of folks make when choosing whether something is too sensitive to run in a public or private cloud.
Karen, this is directly focused on the data. the storage. What are your thoughts on public versus private cloud and data security and data sovereignty?
Yeah, so it certainly is the case that people. I think there's really three concerns that we've seen and that have been fairly extensively documented publicly as well. There is concern, and people don't have a clear, I think in many cases, a clear understanding of exactly what the data sovereignty rules are. We've seen, for example, in Canada, where they don't have, Amazon doesn't have a presence. They will soon, I believe, a presence in Canada, where that really kind of slowed down the growth of AWS in Canada. You also see things in Germany as well. And so I think in many cases people aren't quite sure as well what the rules are, but they have a concept that it's not that they're not allowed to actually move these things outside the country. There's a number of other concerns though as well that I think make this a more complex thing. The first thing is that they have to redo compliance, and so Amazon has this statement about security being a shared responsibility, and effectively what that means is that if you move it out of your data center, you're going to have to go back and redo your compliance, and that's in many cases is going to make it a headache and going to make it a problem to actually do it. The other thing is that if you use the infrastructure as service and you're a developer, for example, and you don't have security expertise, it's your responsibility to do that within the public cloud environment. So it's your responsibility to do access control, to do patching, to how to set up firewalls and so on. And so I think what's happened over the last few years is that I think IT departments are kind of clamping down on that, where developers a few years ago would have just gone out and sort of just deployed this in the public cloud environment. It's not that, Amazon is a secure environment. I don't think that, I think people have gotten over that. Azure is obviously a secure environment as well. But once you move outside your own environment, then responsibilities change. And if you're just going to go out there and assume that, security is taken care of, you're going to be surprised.
All right, let's move on to talk about some of the decision points around charting a path forward for cloud. We have a lot of questions from the audience and that might respond well in this section as well. But we'll start with some general questions. And we've got some questions about this from the audience already as well. So when we think about workloads, what makes the most sense to actually think about getting out of my local data center and moved into the public cloud, or to shift from either public cloud back to private cloud, or from a traditional IT infrastructure to a private cloud? Steve, what are your thoughts on sort of the workload assignment pieces here?
Yeah, I'll start with sort of the most commonly discussed use case, and it's not by what type of workload, it's actually by what phase of the application lifecycle. And I think Kieran also alluded to this, but I'm sure a number of the people on the phone and a number of companies, they almost always at least start by saying, let's have some of our development and testing go on within a public cloud environment. And the reasons for that are pretty obvious. Developers are pretty picky and want to get things faster. So there is that notion of maybe we can provide things with self-service more quickly. Oftentimes the test phase can chew up a ton of resources, and so that burstiness towards the end of a release cycle is something that drives you there. And so maybe not specifically by workload type, but by what phase of application lifecycle. It might start in the public cloud, and then once the release is close to staging and deployment, for all these reasons we've talked about, they might want to bring it back into the private cloud. I think in terms of other types of workloads, again, if you look at the core capabilities of the cloud that are so unique, a lot of them are this, sort of very elastic scalability. So with the security and data sovereignty piece aside for a moment, if you think about applications that run only periodically and can chew up as many resources as you throw at them, maybe it's end of quarter analysis things or other type of batch applications, if you can get the data where it needs to be, that's a very common use case for the public cloud. I'll have Kieran add some other thoughts on that if he likes.
There's one sort of fairly basic one as well, which is using S3 as a place or another object store as a place to actually store data that's accessible throughout, across the globe, right? And so we actually do this as a place to actually store data that needs to be accessed from multiple different sites. You obviously see people like Box and Dropbox using this for mobile access to files, but it's a cost-effective way of actually having a store that's accessible from anywhere. We definitely see the analytics capabilities, particularly if you're just running them periodically, are very good in the public cloud. And as Steve said, you have access to a lot of resources for a short period of time. So those things are excellent fits for a public cloud environment.
And this was a good question to ask because we actually just got this very question from the audience as well. And when we think about technology, it moves fast. I mean, what are some of the things that have changed in the past few years that have affected the feasibility of implementing a private cloud environment? Kieran, why don't you start with that and tell us a little bit about what's happening, especially with Tintri, what you've done to help move this along.
Yeah, so it really has been around solving the problems that are beyond compute, right? So what we've had in the private cloud environment is that, or I won't say in the private cloud environment, the on-premise data center is virtualization's been deployed for a long time. Compute, it's very feasible to do that in an efficient way. But you've had the networking being a complete nightmare. You've had the storage being very, very painful to do. And I think the things that have really changed, and I mentioned these earlier, we're not the only vendor to actually do this, but solving these problems at the infrastructure level. The other thing that you see as well is at the higher level of the system, the increased use of orchestration, the more extensive use of things like Ansible and Puppet and Chef, and then I would say early use of Orchestrator from VMware. So I think it's changes that are occurring at the lower level of the stack in terms of abstracting these hardware resources. But then at the higher level, where you can actually do a level of automation that just wasn't feasible even a few years ago.
Steve, what's changed recently that helps people think about private cloud a little bit in your mind that might be beyond what we just heard?
I certainly think Kieran nailed a lot of the changes. These are where a lot of, I focus on interesting companies trying to build in this space and enable it. And I think those are a big part of it. Maybe just another way for people to think about this is, there are a lot of different phases of when you're implementing and using a private cloud. And I think a lot of these challenges we've talked about, a number of them originally came up for how can I provision a new application? When someone wants to get started, how do I get it started very quickly? And whether it's automation or nicely scaling systems, those come into play. A lot of people then look at, as they're running, can I move things around on the fly and keep them going? And can I make sure that my resources are used efficiently? This is how over time the private cloud is cost effective and can compete. And so I would just add that there are a lot of other things higher up in the stack too, around maybe it's containers or different models for interacting with the apps that are just now coming to bear that I think are going to help things quite a bit as well.
Kieran, we have another question for you, and this goes back a little bit to a question we asked earlier around the difference between private cloud and virtualization. Can you speak a little bit too about the requirements that we should be looking for when we talk about a private cloud environment?
Yeah, and actually, just in terms of discussing this, and we've started to use something that's been out there for quite a while, which is the NIST definition of cloud, which is really around automation, self-service, resource pooling, and measured access, right? And those are things that you get within the public cloud environment. And so, that's what people expect from an Amazon, or what they get from an Amazon or an Azure or a Google. But what you also have within, when you're talking about existing applications and things that are, the vast bulk of your mission critical applications, there are the enterprise requirements of availability and reliability and scale. And, the public cloud vendors have taken a very, very smart approach to this, which is, trying to deal with it at a different level and dealing with it at the application level. But once requires in many cases that you re-implement your application. So what we would see as we would see in many ways, the requirements for implementing a private cloud are constrained by giving you the best stuff that's available within the public cloud, but then it's harder as well, right? So you need to have things like autonomous operation, right? So that the infrastructure is providing you with, things that are done in software that you previously would have had people doing. So what we've had for a long time is DRS from VMware. And Steve and I both worked on that many years ago, and that's been a real success on the compute side. But we've extended that to, we extend that kind of model to operate on the storage side, where you have automatic load balancing on the storage side. The other thing that's a big deal, and I think this is significant both in in public cloud and also in private cloud, is analytics. Actually see what's going on in your infrastructure, diagnose problems, allow you to do planning. And I think that previously people would do things in spreadsheets, or they kind of make guesses. I think the expectation that people have is much, much higher now. The next one would be on automation. The hypervisor vendors have had very strong automation for a long time, but in many cases you're not able to extend that to other parts of the infrastructure. As I mentioned earlier, that's happened on the networking side with SVN, with NSX from VMware, with ACI from Cisco, and we do that on the storage side as well. We think it's a real requirement to actually be able to have those capabilities. And you need scale. So increasingly people want to be able to support tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of applications, whether they're an enterprise or a service provider. And I think, in doing that, the private cloud needs to provide those capabilities on the compute side, on the networking side, and also on the storage side. And the final thing that we really are strong proponents of is choice. Some vendors have taken an approach of saying, we'll provide the complete stack, use our hypervisor, everything will work. But if you want to go outside that, then you're out of luck. And we believe that the ability to be able to work with multiple hypervisors, the ability to be able to work with containers, as Steve had mentioned, the ability to work with multiple networking technologies and server technologies is absolutely critical. And people don't want to be locked in. We think that these capabilities are important for all components, whether it's compute, whether it's networking, or whether it's storage.
Thank you very much. That was really, I think that helps people understand what they need to be thinking about, especially when we talk about the difference between virtualization and private cloud. And in addition, we talked about some emerging technologies before. Let's talk about some more. When we think about containers, how do we need to think about these things with regard to private cloud design and deployment? They're an up-and-coming technology that's really exploding, and are going to need wide support. Kieran, do you want to talk about this a little bit?
Yeah, we're certainly seeing a huge level of interest in containers. And one of the things, actually, if you compare us with OpenStack, so OpenStack's been out there for a while, and there are people deploying it, and I think it's growing slowly. But what we've seen with containers is that it's so easy to deploy it. It's something that you can do on your laptop. There isn't a lot of setup that's actually required. And that's the thing that's been the big driver. And so I think that containers are going to be successful. I think with high probability, people are going to write new applications using containers. They may do it with OpenStack, or they may do it without OpenStack. And I think what you need to consider in terms of private cloud is you need an infrastructure that's actually able to support both these, new applications, these cloud-native applications that are, in many cases, going to be written using containers, but you also need to be able to support existing applications. Again, it comes back to the issue of choice. So, Steve, I'm sure you have an opinion on that one as well.
I think you hit it really well. I think a lot of people hear, and we see this through a lot of new technologies, you hear about, say, containers, or originally it was cloud, or originally before that it might have been virtualization. You hear about it, and it's considered something that is happening, and you need to find a way to get a project going around it. And this is for more mature enterprises. What we see is that for people who are able to write, as Kieran said, cloud-native apps, or that are rewriting something from scratch with no legacy, then they might go to a 100% container environment, and certainly there's some exciting things you can do in that world. But I think the more mainstream adoption is going to be, there are certain things that containers are fantastic for, particularly high-scale, stateless aspects of a microservices-based application. But at the end of the day, they also end up hitting onto something that might be maybe the core database, or something that's very stateful and is used by other applications as well. And so I do think the mainstream enterprise applications, a very large portion of them will require the use of great new technologies like containers, as well as some of the more traditional pieces. And so I do think that the strategies that are trying to appeal for enterprises need to have both of them as equal and manageable under the same framework. And I think that's where a lot of the world will be headed over the next couple of years.
Another technology we hear a lot about is hyperconverged infrastructure and its role in private cloud. Steve, what are your thoughts around hyperconverged and private cloud? And then I'll move it over to Kieran to answer the same question.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have seen that really strong success in this space, certainly from the Nutanix IPO, or a lot of vendors really pitching this. And I would just abstract to the very top level. I think the reason why hyperconverged has gotten a lot of attention and is so interesting comes down to a lot of the reason people want to adopt cloud sorts of technologies, which are, I'd like something simpler that kind of just works. And, traditional IT over the last couple of decades has been selecting best of breed vendors and then having IT responsible for testing whether they work together. And when something goes awry, sometimes you have to try and figure out where the finger of blame should go in terms of what vendors should get to. So I really see the emergence of the hyperconverged infrastructure, other reasons as well, but really just simplicity and something you just can pick up and it just works, and you can kind of snap them together like Lego blocks. And I think that's why, in many ways, these technologies have given some of the benefits that moving to the public cloud have offered before. You can get some of the simplicity while still keeping things under your control and local.
Kieran, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I think hyperconverged is a very interesting technology. I think there's two aspects to it, and I think there's the first is really on the hardware side, which is the combination of server and server and storage, and so I think the traditional model that people have had, where they viewed the deployment of enterprise storage as a very intimidating thing. This is, hyperconverged has actually had a substantial impact on that. But I think it works well at small scale. But I think when you get to, larger scale, we've certainly seen people experiencing problems with performance when you try to deploy at the data center scale, and also efficiency as you actually scale up. The other aspect of hyperconverged, I think, though, that it's less well understood is really around the whole abstraction of service. And as Steve mentioned, the Lego block approach, and where you actually have something that can be automated. And we strongly agree with that approach. On the hardware approach, we don't think it's as scalable. So the model that we think is more significant, and this is actually shown in the picture here, is that we think the problem of addressing how compute, storage, and networking are combined together is not too hard, and that you can address that by doing a software layer that gives you a service. The harder issue is really around how you do self-service, how you do analytics, how you do orchestration. And we believe there isn't going to be a single vendor that actually does that. And our perspective on this is that you want to have a model that is the Lego blocks where you can swap out different Lego blocks, but that they do work smoothly together. So our model would definitely be one where we like the abstraction of service, but we also like the ability to have choice. And there isn't going to be just one vendor that actually is dominant in this space. And you certainly don't want to be locked into somebody like that.
Steve and Kieran, that's all the questions we have for today. Thank you very much for both of you for being here and answering all these questions.
Thank you very much, Scott.
One of the things I'd like to...
I hope that was useful. It's a confusing space.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot more to learn. And one of the things that has happened also to help you with this is Actual Tech Media and Tintree are happy to release a new education site around hybrid cloud and cloud technologies in general. This is available at hybridcloudstorage.org. And one of the premier assets that's available on that site right now is the Girly Guide to Hybrid Cloud Storage, which is a comprehensive book, a look at what's happening in the world of hybrid cloud storage. That site is launched as of this morning, so please feel free to visit and have a look around. We'll be releasing new blog posts and new white papers in the coming days, weeks, and months for that site. And we also have a prize for one lucky winner, a $300 Amazon gift card. First of all, thank you to everyone for being here, but probably Terrence Kung is probably going to be the happiest of the bunch. He just won a $300 Amazon gift card. Terrence will be reaching out to you via email to claim your gift. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and thank you to Tintree and Steve for being here with us today.